Good afternoon, and welcome to the Jewish community of Sedona in the Verde Valley and our program, Talmud for the Curious. This program is part of our adult Jewish education series. I'm Sheldon Hersh, and I will host today's program along with congregational member Richard Witlin and our Rabbi, Alicia Magal. I'll begin with an overview of our course. The internet offers many programs and videos on Talmud, but most are too long, too short, too intense, or just too difficult for us to use as a general overview of Talmud. So because we did not find any ready-made course on Talmud, we have developed our own curriculum, which we believe is appropriate for viewers of all backgrounds and interests. You do not have to have previous experience with Talmud. You don't have to have knowledge of Hebrew or ancient Jewish history. Our program will feature videos, slides, diagrams, and discussion, and we hope to have time for questions at the end of each program. Because this is a new program, we urge you to email any program suggestions that you may have as we go along, and also send me an email if you want bibliography of any material in the course. This will be a dual track program. Richard and I will discuss the secular and historical aspects of Talmud, and Rabbi Magal will address actual Talmud study. There's a lot of material to process, so we may repeat things at times. We're scheduled for a 6-week course, but because this program is new, we really don't know exactly how long the course will run. I will begin by describing my first experience with Talmud. As a young boy in Brooklyn, I attended a neighborhood Hebrew school in the afternoons after public school, where we learned to read Hebrew and learned Hebrew prayers. One day, when I was about 12 years old, the teacher brought up some very large books, and he called them Talmud and said they were very important books for the Jewish people. But when we opened the books and looked inside, all I saw were pages and pages of small Hebrew print, just like this picture. Jenny? And there were no vowels, no punctuation, and most importantly, no English. Then the teacher said that part of the book was in Hebrew, which I couldn't translate, and part was in a different language altogether, Aramaic, which I had never heard of. So my first introduction to Talmud was totally confusing and intimidating, and remained that way for the next 60 years. Thank you, Jenny. Talmud may have been important to my ancestors, but what does it mean to a Jew living in America in the 21st century? So when our education committee planned this course, I wanted to answer that question for myself. In preparing for this course, I learned that to understand Talmud, you must first understand the background and the context within which Talmud was created. Talmud has been likened to a sea. You can't just dive into the sea. You first have to learn to swim. The mistake my boyhood Hebrew teacher made was that he jumped right into the sea without teaching us how to swim or navigate the Talmud. And he left us stranded on dry land, confused and intimidated by the Talmud. So in this course, we're going to teach everyone how to swim in the sea of Talmud by providing the all-important context and background for Talmud study. What is Talmud? Why was it created? Who created it? When and how was it created? For whom was it created? How was it used over the millennia? And what is its meaning and significance for Jews today? That will be Rich's job and my job. We will teach about Talmud, and Rabbi will teach actual Talmud study. So how large is the Talmud? First, let's look at the Hebrew Bible. Jenny?
It starts with the Torah. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible includes the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. For short, you can call the Hebrew Bible Tanakh, which stands for Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. If you're Jewish, saying Tanakh beats the pants off saying Old Testament, which is a Christian term used in contrast to the New Testament.
So the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, is only one part of the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible, or Tanakh, contains 24 books, including the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. Now, Jenny, the next. So, compared with Torah, the Talmud is immense. The Talmud has about 2,700 pages, and each page or daf has two sides. So the Talmud has about 5,400 pages of text and almost 2 million words. The Torah, by comparison, has only 80,000 words, and all 24 books of the Hebrew Bible have about 300,000 words. So Talmud is 23 times larger than the written Torah, and Talmud is 6 times larger than all 24 books of the Hebrew Bible or Tanakh. Talmud is the result of the lifelong work of hundreds of rabbis over hundreds of years discussing hundreds of topics and opinions on Judaism. The Talmud is the record of these discussions. Most discussions in the Talmud are about legal topics, but other parts contain history, philosophy, medicine, astronomy, anecdotes, legends, ethics, recipes, debates, and more. It is a unique document that goes back and forth in time with rabbis who lived hundreds of years apart, arguing with each other across the pages. Like the sea, which is enormous, there is no beginning and no end to Talmud. Talmud starts on page 2, so you're always in the middle of the Sea of Talmud. Talmud is the story of rabbis and sages over millennia trying to understand what God wants us to do and how God wants us to live a goodly life. It is the written record of Judaism's yearning to understand the meaning of truth, justice, and mercy. The Talmud, the story of the Talmud, is the 3,500-year history of the Jewish people. Talmud has been key to Jewish survival despite war, dispersion, and persecution. If Torah is the foundation of Judaism, then Talmud is the central pillar upon which a worldwide Jewish civilization is built. In this course, we will learn why Talmud was indispensable to the Jewish people. We'll learn why it was persecuted, put on trial, and burned in the past. We will discuss the Mishnah, the Gemara, the commentaries. We'll learn that there are actually 2 Talmuds. We'll discuss the sages, along with Rashi, Maimonides, and Hillel. We'll learn how the Talmud was affected by the printing press. We will examine the Talmud's effect on the Puritans, the United States Constitution, and our laws and courts. We will show how Talmud affected the lives of Jews throughout the world and how it continues to grow and be relevant in today's digital world. We'll even find out why Talmud is a bestseller in South Korea. So this is the story of how a Jewish religion centered around animal sacrifices, controlled by a hereditary priesthood, and located solely within Jerusalem, was able to transform itself into an all-encompassing Jewish world centered around the rabbinic study of holy books. This is the story of Talmud. So let's begin at the beginning with a general overview, and I'll turn this over to Richard.
Thank you, Sheldon.
Thank you.
Basically, what I'm going to show you now is a 7-minute video that really is a good overview of what we're going to be talking about for the next 5 or 6 sessions. It moves rather quickly. You don't have to grasp everything. As Sheldon has said, we're going to be going back over things multiple times. So sit back, enjoy the 7 minutes. It lays out a very nice global perspective of the things we're going to be covering in more detail.
On January 1st, 2020, nearly 90,000 people braved cold weather at MetLife Stadium in New Jersey to celebrate finishing reading the entire Talmud. Overflow crowds celebrated indoors at Barclays Center in Brooklyn, and live video feeds connected celebrations around the world, reaching an estimated 1 million people. This event, called the Siyum Hashas, happens every 7.5 years, the time it takes to read the entire 2,711 pages of the Talmud, 1 page per day. A page of Talmud, by the way, looks like like this. It's a masterpiece of graphic design with a layout unchanged for hundreds of years. It's also written in partial sentences in a dead language with no punctuation. So what is the Talmud? And how did this unusual text inspire what might just be the largest and longest-running daily book club of all time? Jewish law is rooted in the Torah, which begins with the creation of the world and traces the Israelites' journey from slavery in Egypt to the Promised Land. Along the way, Moses relays hundreds of mitzvot to the Israelites. Those mitzvot are known as the written Torah. For example, in the Ten Commandments, God says, "But the seventh day is a Sabbath to God. You shall not do any work." The traditional understanding of what those mitzvot mean and how to observe them, like what activities count as work on the Sabbath, is known as the Oral Torah, passed down verbally through generations. By the 2nd century CE, there was a concern that this knowledge would be lost due to persecution and migration as Jews began to spread beyond the land of Israel. So rabbis decided to compile the Oral Torah into what we call the Mishnah. But they didn't just include the rules. The Mishnah also frequently lists the divergent views of different rabbis, preserving minority opinions alongside the accepted answers. Rabbis continued interpreting and debating the meaning of mitzvot for the next few hundred years, expanding on the discussions in the Mishnah and deliberating about what exactly the Mishnah meant. Eventually, those generations of rabbinic debates were themselves compiled into a document called the Gemara. So, unlike the Mishnah, which is more like a how-to guide with some second opinions, the Gemara is a record of legal arguments, one that includes both the accepted majority opinions as well as the rejected minority opinions. In addition to legal talk, the Gemara also includes stories about the rabbis that teach moral and philosophical lessons. Together, the Mishnah and Gemara are known as the Talmud. The Talmud was first written on scrolls, which was still the Jewish format of choice centuries after the Christian world had started using bound books, though the Jews did get on board with books soon thereafter. And it was written in shorthand with no punctuation, which hadn't been invented yet, in Aramaic, which was the common language in the Middle East at the time, but one that was quickly falling into disuse. Over time, because the wording of the Talmud is brief and sometimes cryptic, and in a language hardly anyone spoke anymore, and because it doesn't always specify which opinion was accepted, rabbis felt compelled to explain what the Talmud meant. Famous Talmud commentators included Rashi in France and Maimonides in Cairo. Commentaries on the Talmud were written as separate books. To study Talmud with commentary, you'd need a finger in each book. In the 11th and 12th centuries, Christian scribes began to copy biblical commentary, called gloss, into their Bibles on the same pages as the biblical text. These glossed Bibles had commentary surrounding the text in geometric columns. Jewish scribes took notice and used that format for their books as well. In the 1450s, the book world exploded with the invention of the printing press. By the 1470s, Jewish printers had learned the technology and were printing their own books. A handful of tractates, individual sections of the Talmud divided by subject, were printed in Spain in the 1480s, as well as in northern Italy by a printer named Joshua Sonsino. Sonsino laid out his Talmud like a glossed Bible, with the Talmud text in the middle and the commentary of Rashi on one side. On the other side, Sonsino, his nephew, and their editors featured a few of their favorite Tosafists. The Tosafists, who included Rashi's own son-in-law and grandsons, tried to explain what Rashi's comments meant, and as the publisher, he could pick the Tosafists he liked best. Printing a book like this took a lot of time and resources, and the Sonsinos only managed to print a few tractates. Enter Daniel Bomberg. Bomberg was a Christian from Antwerp who had moved to Venice. A friend convinced him there was money to be made in Jewish books, so he petitioned the Venetian Senate for the exclusive right to print the Talmud in Venice. Between 1519 and 1523, he printed the first complete set of the Talmud. He unabashedly copied Sonsino's geometric page layout and selection of commentaries, and also added page numbers, which were a new invention at the time. If we're being technical, they're actually folio numbers, meaning each leaf gets a single number for both the front and back of the sheet, which then have an A side and a B side. Within 100 years, this page numbering format would go out of style, and the Talmud is probably the only regularly published book today that still uses this old system. Bomberg's edition, and the two more he printed after the first sold out, were a huge success. His state-sanctioned monopoly, high-quality printing, large print runs, and location in the international business hub of Venice made sure of it. Other printers, some of them also Christian, wanted in on the game and put out their own editions in the 1540s and 50s. These new editions kept Bomberg's successful layout and added useful references to biblical verses and related discussions elsewhere in the Talmud, kind of like a massive Wikipedia citation system. They also added even more commentaries around the page as a sales tool. More commentaries equals better value. Persecution and censorship meant printing the Talmud was a fraught endeavor. But despite that, new editions were printed continually over the next 300 years. Almost every single one used Bomberg's layout. This progression culminated with the Vilna edition of the 1880s, whose exact composition is still used to this day. The Talmud has evolved into a page-by-page snapshot of nearly 2,000 years of collaborative discussion. Commentaries that are separated by centuries talk to each other across the page. Today, almost all editions and even digital Talmud apps still rely on the Vilna edition's composition and Bomberg's 16th century layout and pagination. Even the few that don't use his layout still use Bomberg's page numbers for reference, allowing readers to know where they are in the version that has become the standard. Daf Yomi, the practice of studying one page of Talmud a day, was proposed by Rabbi Meir Shapiro in 1923 as a way to link Jews together all over the world. Taking advantage of the fact that all Talmud editions are essentially identical, Daf Yomi enables study groups worldwide to literally be on the same page. Although studying Talmud is often associated with Orthodox men, nowadays, learning Talmud brings people together across continents and backgrounds. It's studied by Jews across the denominational spectrum, including Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, and the avowedly secular. They're learning on planes, trains, and automobiles. In a way, the Talmud's layout captures some of Judaism's most important values: scholarship, debate, history, memory, and community. At the heart of it all is the value Judaism places on both unity and diversity, and searching for truth through study and collaboration.
So that's just a good overview of what we're going to spend our time doing. Sheldon, I know, back to you.
Thanks, Richard. So that's a lot of information to unpack over the next several weeks. So we begin 3,500 years ago, about the year 1300 BCE, before the Common Era, when Moses led the Hebrew people out of slavery from the land of Egypt. According to Jewish tradition, Moses went up on Mount Sinai, and God gave Moses the 10 Commandments, and God gave Moses the written Torah. But according to Jewish tradition, God actually gave Moses 2 Torahs. One was the written Torah, or written law, the scroll with which we are familiar. And the second Torah was the oral Torah, or oral law. To understand Talmud, we must understand the key concept of an oral Torah, because it is this second Torah, the oral Torah, which forms the centerpiece, the heart of Talmud. According to traditional belief, this oral Torah was given to Moses on Mount Sinai at the same time as he received the written Torah. And it was passed down by word of mouth for generations upon generations until the oral Torah was written down by rabbis to become the basis for Talmud. We begin with several video clips of Rabbi Skobach discussing the oral Torah. But first, please, we have a photo because the speaker is going to talk and mention totafot, and we want everyone to know what he's talking about. So the speaker mentions totafot, and totafot are tefillin, or phylacteries. These are the black boxes which Jews put on their left arm and forehead at morning prayer, which contains verses of Torah. Jenny, now we can start the video, please.
The oral Torah essentially is the complete revelation of God. And the simplest reason for this is that it should be very obvious to anyone who simply reads the text of the 5 books of Moses that that doesn't contain all the information. It's not a difficult premise to understand. For example, the Bible says over a dozen times that the Sabbath is one of the central institutions of Judaism, and the Bible says numerous times we're not allowed to do any melacha on the Sabbath. And the problem is that this word melacha is not a simple word to define. There's no cognate word in the Bible. It doesn't say in Hebrew, don't do any work. It doesn't say don't do any avodah on the Sabbath. And even if it did, what would that mean? What would it mean not to do any work? Would you define that the way you'd learn about work in a physics class? In physics, if you pick up a book and you carry it across the room, you've done work. Do you define work by not going to work on the Sabbath day, but anything else you do outside the context of having a paid job is permissible on the Sabbath? Does it mean you can't do anything that's laborious and difficult to do? So for someone that finds mowing their yard difficult, they can't do it. But for the person that loves taking care of the yard, they can do it on the Sabbath. So even if the Bible said don't do any work, we wouldn't know what in the world it was talking about. But the Bible doesn't say that. The Bible says don't do any malacha, and it's deemed a capital crime. It's a very severe mistake to do malacha on the Sabbath. We have no idea what that entails. So when God says those words, which we find in the text, don't do any malacha, what does it mean? How do we understand it? We don't know. When the Bible says that on the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot, you're to take the fruit of a beautiful tree, what are you supposed to do? When the Bible gives penalties for violating the Torah, at what age do those penalties become meaningful? Meaning, when is the age of majority? When does a person become responsible for observing the laws of the Bible? At the age of 7, 10, 13, 15, 18, 20? The Bible doesn't say. What do we do? How do we know? And anyone that reads the Bible with any kind of sensitivity understands and realizes that we don't have all the information. The Bible explains how to get divorced. If your marriage comes to an end, there's a way of divorcing, and this is the way you do it. But the Bible never defines how to get married. Meaning, what do you have to do to enter in the kind of a relationship where if you want to end it, you've got to do it in the way the Bible defines? Do you do that if people are just living together? Or do you have to actually do something specific in order to be considered legally married? And that's not defined in the Bible. The Bible says in the book of Exodus and the book of Deuteronomy that we're supposed to put something on our arm as a sign and to put totafot between our eyes. Now, anyone that comes from Mars and picks up the Bible and reads that, they're going to say, what sign do you put upon your arm? What is that sign? And when do you do it? And how long do you have to keep it there? And what in the world are totafot that you're supposed to put between your eyes? And again, these are just several examples, but there are thousands of such examples where it's very clear that the material, the information that's in the text of the 5 books of Moses is simply not adequate. It could not have been the entire revelation. The Bible says if you want to eat meat, God says you need to slaughter the animals as I have commanded you. There's no instructions in the 5 books of Moses how to slaughter an animal. So what do those words mean, as I have commanded you? Where did God command us? So obviously it was a command not committed to writing. It is simply artificial to insist that God only communicates in writing. For example, when God instructed Moses to build a sanctuary in the 25th chapter of the book of Exodus, and later elaborated on in the book of Numbers, the written instructions were not enough. So the Bible tells us that God showed Moses a diagram of what the tabernacle is supposed to look like. I don't know about you, but my Bible, the Torah in that ark, doesn't have any pictures or diagrams in it. So obviously God gave Moses information. These diagrams were shown to Moses. It says so in the text. But we don't have those diagrams. There was information given to Moses that was not written down. I want to share one more piece of this. A legitimate question could be, why didn't God just simply include all the information in a written text? Why did God divide the information between what was written in the 5 books of Moses and what was kept oral? Why not just put all of it in a book? There are many reasons. One reason, which we're not going to spend much time on, is the fact that having it oral ensures that you will have a teacher. You need to have a teacher. Otherwise, if all you have is a text, any Tom, Dick, or Harry can just seize the text and insist that I understand it. I have the true understanding. And one of the problems that our sages tell us is that if we didn't have an oral Torah, the nations of the world could just abscond with, hijack our writings, our Torah, and claim that they're the real Jews and they have the real interpretation, which is exactly what happened in history. Christianity, at least many forms of Christianity, insist that the Jewish people got it wrong, and now the true Israel is the church, and they understand the scriptures, not the people of Israel. So the fact that there's an oral Torah requires that you have a teacher that can ensure that you are reading and understanding the scriptures properly. Because the teacher has to have received it from their teacher. There's an unbroken line of teachers and students going back to the revelation of Torah itself. There's another important reason that the Torah is both partially written and partially oral. And that's that it allows us to have a stereoscopic revelation. A revelation in stereo. What do I mean? If all we had was a written text, that written text is basically flat. It's one-dimensional. Let me illustrate what happens when you have a written text that is supplemented by an oral Torah. The written text says that if you attack someone, and in the course of your attack, you chop off their arm, let's say you have a machete with you, or you take out one of their eyes, pretty horrible crime. The Torah says very clearly, an eye for an eye, an arm for an arm, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot. If all you had was the written text of the Torah, you would assume that God's intention is that if someone takes out someone else's eye, the court will take that a criminal, and the court will have this criminal's eye removed. Now, I would propose there are three serious problems with this understanding. Problem number one is that it's barbaric. For us to take a machete and chop off someone's arm or poke out their eye is simply barbaric. That's not the biggest problem. The second problem is that it wouldn't help the victim. If someone was crippled or maimed, and all the court is told to do is to maim the attacker, how is the victim being helped? And number three, it wouldn't be fair. It wouldn't be fair punishment. Because let's imagine the attacker was someone that was a one-eyed attacker. Here's this pirate with one eye, and he pokes out your eye. And the court says, well, we're going to take out his remaining eye. Well, wait a second. You've got one eye left. You can see quite a bit with one eye. But if you take out this pirate's one remaining eye, he's completely blind. Is that equitable? Is that fair? Or, let's imagine the attacker is an opera singer. This opera singer comes and chops off your hand or pokes out your eye. And you are a pianist or a surgeon or a pilot. Well, you can't function anymore, missing an eye or missing an arm. As an opera singer, they can do all those things. Or if you switch the roles, so an eye for an eye, an arm for an arm, is not equitable. It's not fair. So number one, it's not fair. Number two, it's barbaric. Number three, it doesn't help the victim. So the oral Torah tells us that if someone maims someone else, the punishment is they have to compensate the victim monetarily for the loss of their limb, for their doctor's bills, for the loss of their wages, for the pain they experienced, and for the embarrassment they're going to have to go through. The court will assess each of these five things. How much is the limb worth? How much are their doctor bills going to come to? How much are their wages they're going to lose? How do we assess the pain they went through and their embarrassment? And the victim is compensated for those five things. So here, in practice, we do not poke out anyone's eye. We do not chop off anyone's hands. We compensate for these 5 things. And this helps the victim. It is not barbaric, and it's equitable. So we have a big problem now. If the law actually in practice is that you don't chop off anyone's hand, you don't poke out anyone's eye, you compensate for these 5 things, why didn't the Torah just say that? Why didn't the Bible just say, money for an eye? Money, you write a check if you take off someone's arm. And the reason would be that that would make the Bible crass. It would be crass to say, if you chop off someone's arm, write them a check. Write them a check? Everything's hunky-dory? What the Bible is trying to teach us, by writing, in writing, an eye for an eye, is to teach us how disgusting and horrible and barbaric that action is. If you chop off someone's arm or you take out one of their eyes, that action is so horrible, you really deserve on some level to have it happen to you. That's how terrible the act is. That would not be captured by the Torah saying, write them a check. The Torah is trying to convey to us viscerally that the criminal should understand, the attacker should understand their behavior is so horrible that if they do that, they deserve to have their eye taken out or their arm chopped off. But it's barbaric to do that. And it wouldn't help the victim. And it's not equitable. So in practice, we compensate for them monetarily. So now the fact that we have a written Torah and an oral Torah allows us to have a revelation from God that's stereoscopic. The written text is trying to convey to us how heinous the crime is. The oral Torah is giving us in practice what we actually do. We have the same thing when the Torah says over and over and over again, if you violate the Sabbath, you'll surely die. You read in the 5 books of Moses, it seems that every Monday and Thursday, the court's going to be executing someone, because so many crimes have the death penalty. Is that really what God wants? A society where people are being executed routinely for violating the Torah? We know that our sages tell us that if a court executed one person in 7 years, and one opinion says if even in 70 years, if the court killed one person in 70 years, it was a bloody court. So the truth is that in practice, we almost never killed anyone. And one of the ways that happened was that the Torah's laws of testimony were so rigorous that it was almost impossible to find someone guilty and culpable of a capital crime. That God's will is not that people should be killed all the time for violating the Torah. And that's why the laws of testimony are made in such a way that made it virtually impossible to convict and execute someone of a capital crime. But if that's the case, why does the Torah keep on saying, if you do this, you'll be certainly killed. If you do that, you'll be certainly killed. So again, the written text of the Torah is trying to convey to us how serious the crime is. You should know that violating the Sabbath is not small potatoes. That violating the Sabbath is serious business. It's, on some level, an ultimate sin. It is so bad that, on some level, you deserve to be executed. But practically speaking, the oral Torah tells us that's not what we do. Because God is not interested in just executing everyone. So what happens is we have a dynamic relationship between the written text and the oral Torah, which provides a much richer revelation than if we only had one. They work hand in glove, where often the written text is giving us some ideal, and the oral Torah modifies it to teach us what we do in practice. And these two are critical, and they work together, and they each provide information and teachings that would not be available if we only had one of these two.
I thought he was a very good speaker and makes a very good point. Next is a short video by Rabbi Mizrahi. It's 2 minutes. This is a very interesting discussion about circumcision and the confusing word, the orla, that the Torah uses to describe circumcision. Jenny?
Now I want to ask you a question. Please raise your hand if you want to talk. Do you think it's possible that God gathered 15 million Jews around Mount Sinai 3,320 years ago? He spoke the first 2 commandments. Everybody heard God and Moshe speaking. He gave Moshe, after 40 days, he gave him the Torah. Moshe came down. He wrote to them the Torah. And nowhere in the Torah it says how to do the mitzvot. So why you gave us Torah? To waste time? Why would you give me 613 commandments when you did not tell me even one of them how to do? I don't know. How to make a matzah? I don't know. How to make circumcision? It's one of the 3 covenants. Shabbat, Brit, Tefillin. Shabbat, circumcision, and Tefillin. I don't know how to circumcise a boy. So why are you telling me, be careful, if you don't circumcise him, he's a goy? He did not become officially a Jew. If you never told me how to do a Brit Milah in the Torah, you never told me where to cut. The Torah says, cut the orla in the 8th day. Where is orla? Nowhere in the book. Nowhere. I claim this is orla. He claimed, no, orla it's this. He claimed, no, this is orla. He said, no, orla it's the nails. Everybody think orla it's something else. Without the oral Torah, you wouldn't know.
Circumcision is the sign of the covenant. That's a big deal. It is an important Jewish custom, but only the oral Torah explains how to perform it. Now, this last 30-second video by Rabbi Skobak, who we saw, I found eye-opening. The words in the written Torah have only consonants. There are no vowels printed in the Torah because vowels wouldn't be invented for another 1,000 years. So the vowels are just assumed to be there under the words. That's one reason chanting Torah is so difficult. But by changing the imaginary vowels, those little dots and dashes, under the Hebrew words, you can change the entire meaning of the Torah text. Jenny?
In Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 21, Lo sevashel gedi bechalev imo or bechalav imo. If you open up a Torah scroll, you'll see there are no punctuation marks, there are no dots, there are no vowel markings. So the word chet lamed bet can be read as chalav, milk, or chalev, fat. So are we told not to boil a kid in its mother's milk or in its mother's fat? So the actual reading of the Torah itself we wouldn't know without an oral explanation.
This clip is a 30-second clip, and he discusses the verse in the written Torah that says, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. He goes on to say that the consonants, the Hebrew word in the Torah that spells out milk, if you change the vowels around, the little points under the word, it not only can spell milk, but it can spell fat. Don't boil a kid in its mother's fat. So without the oral Torah telling us how to fulfill the commandments in the written Torah, there would be innumerable arguments about Jewish custom and practice. If not for the oral Torah, half the Jews in the world would say kosher means you can't mix meat and milk, while the other half could say, no, kosher means you can't fry or saute meat in animal fat. Thankfully, the oral Torah clarifies this. So the oral Torah's job is to explain unknown words and concepts in the Torah, to give a detailed plan of action on how to fulfill the commandments, and to mitigate the harsh degrees which appear in the written Torah, like an eye for an eye. These few examples show us how lost Judaism would be without the oral Torah. The oral Torah allows us to understand the written Torah and use it in our everyday lives. The specific customs we perform to make Shabbat, Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, all special, stem from the oral law as recorded in the Talmud. When the written Torah says you should afflict yourself on Yom Kippur, what does that mean? Do we flagellate or whip ourselves? Do we rend our clothing? No, because the oral Torah explains that affliction means you should fast on that day. Similarly, the holiday candles we light the festive meals we share, the specific notes we blow on the shofar, the mezuzah on our doorpost, how we get married, how we are buried, what prayers we say, even the 4 questions we recite on Passover. These and hundreds upon hundreds of Jewish customs come from the oral law as recorded in the Talmud. The Talmud provided the framework for rabbinic Judaism as we know it today. It framed our Jewish lives and an entire Jewish civilization, and even includes such mundane things like how we should put on our shoes in the morning, how we cut our fingernails. The oral law contains all the details about the commandments that were not fleshed out in the written text. Consider that the written Torah is simply a general table of contents for Jewish living, just listing the topics. And if you want to read the whole chapter about how to do something, then you have to go to the oral Torah, the Talmud, to read about it. The full explanation of each commandment appears only in the oral Torah or Talmud. The written Torah mentions slaughtering of animals indirectly and only in passing. But to find out the details, you have to go to those chapters or sections in the Talmud on slaughtering animals to learn how to do it correctly. The written and the oral Torah worked hand in glove to create our Jewish civilization. Now, let's look chronologically at how the oral law and Talmud was developed. Jews experienced the oral Torah, the oral law and Talmud in 4 stages. It went from oral at Mount Sinai to written in the year 200 of the Common Era, following the destruction of the Second Temple, to printed after the invention of the printing press, to digital with the introduction of computers. From the oral stage in 1300 BCE, it was passed down orally from father to son and teacher to student for 1,500 years until it was written down in the year 200. From the written stage to the printed stage took another 1,300 years. And from the printed stage to today's digital stage took 500 years. And as we went from oral to written to printed to digital, each stage allowed more and more people to experience the oral law and Talmud until today we have the digital Talmud, which makes Talmud accessible to the entire world. So now let's put everything we've talked about together. Next one, Jenny, please. This is where we started from, a black and white picture of Talmud with a confusing page of text. Although there are all sorts of geometric configurations to a page of Talmud, this is one of the most common. So what are we really looking at? Jenny, let's look at a schematic page to visualize the page better. Here we see that the Talmud page is essentially one central section or box of text surrounded by other texts. The center section is the most important section, the section where the action takes place. It's easier to see this if we break the page into colored sections. Jenny? So in 200 CE, when the oral law was first written down onto a scroll, it became the Mishnah. And the Mishnah sits in the pink central section of the page, right at the top of the important central section. Only the pink section is the Mishnah, the oral law. The bottom yellow section is the Gemara, the first and oldest commentary on the Mishnah, which we'll discuss in detail next week. But for now, only look at the pink Mishnah, which is the oral law, an equal part of Torah, a piece of divine revelation. The surrounding texts are important, but they are essentially man-made commentaries and pale in significance to the center pink section of the oral law. So now let's return to our timeline and combine it with the Mishnah. Jenny? Good. So here we see that the oral law gets written down in the year 200 of the Common Era and becomes a scroll of Mishnah. Jenny? Then, after hundreds and hundreds of years of commentaries upon commentaries upon commentaries, the Mishnah evolves into a large document, a book that we now call Talmud. Jenny? And finally, after the Mishnah and the Talmud have been debated and discussed and commented upon over the course of the next 1,000 years, the rabbis and sages from that book developed the laws and customs of Rabbinic Judaism, which we practice today. So here we see that the Mishnah, the Oral Torah, the central part of the Talmud remains in the center of the box, and all around the page is simply commentary.
Go lie down because we're going to go out.
So today we explored what is the Oral Torah, oral law, the second Torah. We've seen that the Oral Torah explains the commandments, defines the words, and mitigates the harsh degrees in the written Torah. We have seen that the Oral Torah, once written down, became the Mishnah, and everything else on the Talmud page are essentially commentaries about the Mishnah. Next week, we'll discuss the dire conditions of Judaism under Roman rule, and we'll discuss the when, why, and how the Talmud became Judaism's brilliant response to Roman persecution. Next, Jenny. So next week, we continue to explore the Mishnah in pink, along with the Gemara in yellow, which was the next stage in Talmud development. We will look at the internal workings of the Mishnah and the Gemara, which together form the Talmud. And I'm going to stop here now and turn it over to Rabbi.
Thank you, Sheldon and Richard, for a wonderful overview that you've just given. What I'm going to do now is to actually dive into a page of Talmud. But before I start, I would like to ask you to do something. Everybody listening, I want you to go and get a cookie or a fruit, something sweet, and then something to drink, either tea or something stronger considering the hour, and then return. So I'm going to take I have a hamantash in here, and I have some tea in my favorite mug that's got my husband and me on it. So I just want you to run out quickly and get something and come right back. And the reason for that, even while I'm talking, you can do that. The reason for that is because my first Talmud teacher, Rabbi Alicia, explained how he started learning Talmud with his father. His mother would always bring him some cookies and some milk, and then he would start. He'd put on his kippah with his father, and he would start to study. And he became a rabbi of one congregation in LA for 39 years. And he said that for him, the learning was always sweet. And for you too, I want your learning to be sweet. So, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei minei mizonot, which is something you say if you don't have bread, but it's something with flour, or for you gluten-free people, it would be the same. I want to begin with something sweet and a bit of tea, so that learning is not just from the head, it's from the heart, and it's a total experience. I hope most of you are back now and you've had a little, even a clementina or some sweet fruit, but I want you to have some sweet taste as we begin. Good. So I'm going to repeat some of the things that Sheldon and Richard and the videos showed. You do not have to remember anything we say, because we're going to do it, as Sheldon said, in layers and repeated. And each time it'll hit differently. And at one point you'll go, now I got it. So just wait for that moment to happen. You don't have to remember a thing, and there are no tests. So we spoke before about what is in the Tanakh, the Torah, the 5 books, prophets, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, writings. These 3 together form the Hebrew Bible. For those of you who are studying mysticism, you may have come to the Zohar, or you may be interested in Midrashim, creative stories. But we're going to go straight from the Torah to the Mishnah, the 6 books of the Mishnah. They're called orders. And then there are oral things that were not written down. There were commentaries. It's called the Baraita and later commentaries. And we're going to go straight from the Mishnah to the Talmud. As it was said earlier, there are two Talmuds, one done in Babylon called the Bavli, and one it's called Yerushalmi, but it was done in Palestine, in the Galil, really, in the Galilee. And it followed, historically, you're going to hear a lot more about that next week. From there were generations of commentary and sort of bottom line, what's the ruling? Again, you don't have to remember any of this. I wanted to just put it in context for you. Now, if you remember at the Passover Seder, we were singing Echad Miyodea, who knows one, and we start at 13 and go down. And 6 is Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, Chamisha Chumshei Torah, etc. 6 orders of the Mishnah. These are the 6 orders. One is about seeds, and we're going to be talking about that today. It includes things about prayers and blessings, since when you eat foods, you say certain blessings. One is Moed, about the festivals. One is Nashim, with all kinds of laws about marriage and divorce. Nizikin is damages, civil law and ethics. Kadoshim, you can hear the word kadosh in there, holy things. And that has to do pretty much with the sacrifices in the temple, even though at this point the temple was destroyed. And toharot are purities, ritual purity. So again, we have 6 orders. Today, I'm going to talk first about a page from Zeraim. So Zeraim is the first order, and it has several tractates. There are 63 tractates in the whole Talmud. And we're going to deal with one of the tractates in one of the orders. Blessings and prayers in the order of Zeraim, seeds, and the tractate is Brachot, which means blessings. So here's that page you saw just a minute ago, and it's called Me'amtai Bet. Every page starts, every of the tractates starts in 2 because 1 is a mystery. We don't know the beginning, but we start every folio page on 2, and this is the side A, and the next side would be side B. And this is in Aramaic, and it says, from what time do we say the Shema? And again, here we have the Mishnah, here we have the Gemara, Mishnah meaning a second repeat, and Gemara meaning a completion, a commentary. Here you have the Rashi commentary, and you have his son-in-law and grandsons over here commenting on his commentary. This part's very, very interesting because just like in, let me show you it here. This is like an internet link. So they want to show you, oh, you're interested in this topic? Well, in the 6 orders, you can also find it here and here and here, where they discuss the topic from a different angle. This was added in the 16th and 18th centuries. So you can imagine this is on this one page, and it's like that on every page. You have a conversation that goes over 1,000 years. You have a generational conversation on the page. And it won't be until the internet that you're able to do such a thing again, where we link from here to here. What does he say? What does he say? And this is the format that we're going to be looking at. Okay, so now we're going to dive into the Sea of Talmud. And I was thinking in the Sea of Talmud, what we're going to give you is a cruise to various ports. We're going to be arriving at various places in this at the Sea of Talmud, and so that it'll be more understandable. The Mishnah and then the Talmud are asking the question, what do you mean when you say, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Hear, O Israel, God is one, and you shall love God with all your heart and soul and might. And these words you shall teach and walk and deal with it when you lie down and when you rise up. B'shochbecha u'b'kumecha. So what does it mean when you lie down? what is the earliest time you could do it? What is the latest time? And from this very, very simple quote, we're going to have pages and pages and pages of which I've just taken an excerpt. Again, just to repeat, the Mishnaic period is around the turn of the millennium until 200. And then what we're going to talk about today is in Brachot, from the first order, Zeraim, and we're going to look at blessings and prayers. Particularly, I picked the Shema and the Amidah. The Talmud, both the Babylonian and the Yerushalmi, but we're going to focus on the Babylonian, will comment on what the Mishnah began. So, the beginning of Tractate Brachot, the first tractate in the first of the 6 orders of Mishnah, opens the very beginning with a discussion of the recitation of Shema. Why? Because the recitation of Shema encompasses an acceptance of the yoke of heaven and of the mitzvot. And as such, it forms the basis for all subsequent teachings. The Mishnah, as we're going to see, opens with the laws regarding the appropriate time to recite the Shema. Now we've just entered. All of that was introduction. So now we're really diving in. Brachot 2, side A. Me'amtai korin et hashma be'aravim, which is Aramaic, and it says, from when, that means from what time, does one recite Shema in the evening? Now you're going to notice that there are bold print words and not bold. You see how short this is? You see how long the translation is? That's because for us to understand it, we have to unpack the shortened cryptic words of the Mishnah, because it was just too much to write all of the commentary, all of the words. So you just know that all it says is the bolded words, and the in-between words explain it a little better. From when, that is from what time, does one recite Shema in the evening? From the time when the priests enter to partake of their teruma. What is teruma? So they assume that you know all this. The writers here were rabbis for rabbis, and they assumed that you knew the whole Torah, that you knew what this was referring to. At the time of the, when the temple stood, the priests would take part of the meat that had been offered on the altar, and they would come inside and they would eat some of this truma, which means donated food. Truma is a donation. So they're asking from when, and then until when. Until when does the time for the recitation extend? This just says until the end of the first watch. What's a watch? So the night was divided into certain watches, sometimes 3, sometimes 4. The term used in the Torah indicate the time for the recitation of the evening Shema is shofbecha, when you lie down. Well, that's not so specific, which refers to the time in which individuals go to sleep. Some of you are early sleepers, some of you go to bed at midnight. What time is that? Therefore, the time for the recitation of Shema is the first portion of the night, when individuals typically prepare for sleep. That is the statement of Rabbi Eliezer. Now, that's very important because we're going to learn more about all these characters. They disagreed with each other. They had opinions. They would offer stories. They would try to convince the others. And if you had clicked back here, if you had clicked on the Mishnah part that says the first watch and you went over to Rashi, Rashi would explain what it is the first watch. So we're going to do that click in the way that we can here. The end of the first watch, he explains, a third of the night, as will be explained in the Gemara. He says, have patience, you're going to hear about this more. And from then on, the time has passed, for it is not the time of lying down, and it is not referred to in the word bishop becha. Also, before this period is not considered the time for lying down. Wait a minute. You guys, when we come to synagogue, don't we say the Shema? Rashi wants to refer to that. Therefore, if one reads the Shema before, he does not fulfill his obligation. Woo. If so, why do we read the Shema in the synagogue? in order to stand in tefillah, in prayer, in connection with words of Torah, as it is taught in the Baraita, that's a commentary that's not written down, in the Jerusalem Talmud Brachot. So he's referring to other places and other explanations. Therefore, one would have to read again after it gets dark. In this case, reading the first section of the Shema at bedtime suffices. So that incredible commentary says why we read the Shema in the synagogue and why that's not enough, and you still have to read it at bedtime when you go to sleep. Now, HaChachamim Omrim, the rabbis say, until midnight. The time for recitation of the evening Shema is until midnight. Oh, Rabban Gamliel says, I don't agree with Rabbi Eliezer. You can say the Shema until dawn. B'shoch Bacha is to be understood as a reference to the entire time people sleep in their beds, the whole night. Uh-oh, we have a discussion here. Is it when you first go to sleep, or could it be till midnight, or could it be until dawn? Now, I just brought this to you to show you how complicated these discussions are, these disagreements, and the whole disagreement is written down for a purpose. So the Mishnah relates that Rabban Gamliel practiced in accordance with his ruling. And in case you didn't get it, they're going to give you a little story. Here's the story. There was an incident where Rabban Gamliel's sons returned very late from a wedding hall. You can imagine they've been partying, right? And they said to him, because they so far hadn't said Shema, they had been preoccupied with celebrating with the groom and bride. And they said to their father, we did not recite Shema. What did he answer? If the dawn has not yet arrived, you are obligated to recite Shema. So he stretched that because they had just come back from a party. They hadn't gone to bed yet. You still can say it. Since Rabban Gamliel's opinion disagreed with that of the rabbis, he explained to his sons, no, the rabbis actually agree with him. This is how he termed it. It's not only with regard to the halacha, the ruling of the recitation of Shema, but rather wherever the sages say until midnight, the mitzvah may be performed until dawn. Well, this is pretty radical. If they say midnight, then how come he understands that being till dawn? Aha. Now, this is a lot of words, but what I'm trying to show you here is how they base their argument on what they read in the Torah, what they understood from practice in their lives, and what was done at the time that the temple stood when the priests took the offerings and offered it on the altar. Now there's no offerings, there's no priests, there's no temple at this time, but still it creates a precedent, and here it is. Rabban Gamliel cites several cases in support of his claim, such as the burning of fat and limbs on the altar. Now you can imagine that if they're burning, it doesn't just go out quickly. It can be burning all night until morning when the fire on the altar burns it. And therefore that truma, that food, could be eaten until dawn. From that, he draws the conclusion that you can also say the Shema, because the prayers have taken the place of the offerings. So if the offerings could be eaten and by the priests until morning, so the Shema as a prayer could be said until morning. Do you see how they're doing that? That is the logic. So wait a minute, why did the sages say that they may be eaten only until midnight? Is it dawn or is it midnight? Aha, this is in order to distance a person from transgression, because if one believes that you have until dawn to perform the mitzvah, he might be negligent and postpone it until the opportunity to perform the mitzvah has passed. So you don't go to the very extreme of what's allowed. You hold yourself back, and they made a wall. They made a kind of, often we talk about the fences around the Torah. Well, there's fences around the rules too. So the Gemara now is going to reference the Mishnah. That yellow part is referencing the pink part. The Mishnah opens with the laws concerning the appropriate time to recite Shema with the question, from when, the beginning, does one cite Shema in the evening? And with regard to this question, the Gemara asks, wait a minute, process. On the basis of what prior knowledge does the Tana, the early sages of our Mishnah, ask from when? they're asking about the process, not anymore about the timing, but why did they make their argument like this? It would seem from his question that the obligation to recite Shema in the evening was already established, and that the Tana, these early sages, seeks only to clarify details. And the Gemara asks, what distinguishes the evening Shema? Why was that taught first? Why don't you teach the morning Shema first? It's in the morning blessings. Those of you who come Wednesday morning, or you come to any service, you know that in the morning you say the Shema. They say, hey, most mitzvot apply during the day. They should have taught about the morning Shema before discussing the evening Shema. This is sort of a red herring because they really know the answer, but they just want to emphasize two reasons. Here is a response. The Tanaim are the first generation, bases himself on the verse as it is written. You will talk of them when you sit in your home, when you walk along the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up, that we saw from Deuteronomy. By teaching the laws of the evening Shema first, the Tana has established that the teachings of the oral Torah correspond to that which is in the written Torah. So when is the time for the recitation of Shema, of lying down, as commanded in the Torah? From when the priests enter to partake of this food, this truma. Just as the written Torah begins with the evening Shema, so the oral Torah has too. But now they're going to have even a stronger precedent. Another explanation opens with the evening Shema. Why evening rather than morning? The precedence is from the creation of the world. Vayihi erev, vayihi boker, yom echad. And there was evening and there was morning, one day. According to this verse, the day begins with the evening and not the morning. So those of you who have a yard site of a loved one, remember, we always ask you, did they die after sunset or before sunset? Because then if it's after sunset, it's the next day in the Hebrew calendar. So for both of these reasons, it was appropriate to open the discussion of the laws of the recitation of Shema with the evening Shema. So they talked about from when to when, why are you talking about the evening, and what are the precedents? I think I've been talking a lot, and I just want you to know that this discussion continues and continues and continues, and they talk more about when is it night, when is the first watch. They bring forth a verse from Nehemiah, which talks about 3 stars, which we know from Havdalah. So for the pages that I scrolled down, I knew we wouldn't get to them, but visually, I wanted you to see how the digressions and the thoughts of the rabbis went from one topic to another and to another and to another until finally come to some conclusion. Now, I'm jumping to Brachot 3a, and this one is on the Amidah, another related story, and this one is just adorable. This is incidental to the mentioning of the elevated significance of the night watches. So they talked about the night watch. Oh, by the way, this reminds me, here's a related story. It was taught in a Baraita, which is an earlier oral commentary that wasn't written down, that Rabbi Yosef said, I was once walking down the road when I entered the ruins of an old abandoned building among the ruins of Jerusalem. Remember, it was all destroyed at that time, in order to pray. I noticed that Elijah of blessed memory came and guarded the entrance for me and waited at the entrance until I finished my prayer. Do you understand this is sort of dreamlike now? When I finished praying and exited the ruin, Elijah said to me, deferentially as one would address a rabbi, greetings to you, my rabbi. And I answered him, greetings to you, my rabbi, my teacher, Rabbi Mori. And Elijah said to me, my son, why did you enter this ruin? I said to him, in order to pray. And Elijah said to me, you should have prayed on the road. And I said to him, well, I was unable to pray along the road because I was afraid I might be interrupted by travelers and would be unable to focus. Another retelling of this says, I was afraid I'd be beset by robbers. And Elijah said to me, you should have recited the abbreviated prayer instituted for just such circumstances. So now Rabbi Yosef turns to his colleagues and says, at that time, from that brief exchange, I learned from him 3 things. I learned that one may not enter a ruin. I learned that one may not need not enter a building to pray, but he can pray along the road. And 3, I learned that one who prays along the road recites an abbreviated prayer so that he may maintain his focus. Now, my friends, that abbreviated prayer for the Amidah is in our prayer books today. There's one for Shabbat and there's one for weekday, and it's only this long instead of pages long. So what I've done today is introduced the idea of the page of Talmud, and I showed you a couple of instances of the way the arguments go, one rabbi to another, drawing precedence from Torah, from prophets, from experience, and from the offerings at the temple. Next week, I'm going to talk more about story, Agadah, which is like a story, a parable to teach, just like the ones I showed you here. The week after that, as Sheldon and Richard are going to be explaining more about the history, I will go into Halacha, which are rulings. Holech means to walk. So this is the way, this is the Tao, right? This is the way you walk in the world, the rulings, always including the minority opinions, which might be needed in the future. The week after that, I'll pick a particular topic, and I'll show that you need citations from various sources, not just in one place, to prove your point on that topic. The week after that will be codes, responsa. We hinted at that at the beginning, how these Talmudic teachings came to be applied throughout the ages, considering scientific advances in the modern world. And the 6th week, I'll delve more deeply into the stories, the rulings, and the applications. Oh, that's us today. So I'm going to stop my share. We have about 10 minutes. I know I spoke quickly and this was a lot of material, but I would very much like you to now open up anyone who has a question. I'm going to move to gallery view. And with the exciting opening that we've had, all that history, all that explanation, I just want to offer one quote from Talmud. The bashful cannot study properly. So don't be bashful, ask your questions, and they'll either be answered by one of us today, or perhaps we'll put it off to a later week. So,
Rabbi, before we open it to questions, I just want to emphasize that what we saw was just a sentence or two in the Mishnah, the oral law, about the Shema. And then the rabbi went to 20 pages of this rabbi and that rabbi, and this is why, and this is why. It's sort of like making a sausage. And at the end, we come down to, we say it at this time and this time. And that's how the rabbis developed our law. Thank you.
When they're arguing, are they all at the same time? The stories, most of the time will be that they actually had the conversation. Sometimes it'll be 100 or 200 years later and they're quoting and saying, I disagree with that. So the time frame is irrelevant. It's the idea and also the custom of the time. It's supposed to be constantly updated. That's why it was supposed to be oral. It was supposed to be that we too would be discussing when can you say the Shema, and we would have our own ideas. However, because of the oppression and the dispersing of our people, it was felt, let's write this down, but it's never supposed to be closed. And so we too, in our own way on Zoom today, are adding another column to the page of Talmud. So you can ask a question just by raising your hand or calling out. I'm not able to see the chat right now. Let me see.
There is no chat. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
If you wanted to ask a question, you'll probably need to check and unmute yourself.
Well, Richard said in the Second Temple period, the end of the first watch was 9 p.m. Now the watches, remember, they didn't have clocks, so they would divide the day into so many watches, and it would be how much daylight and how much night. And so those watches would expand and get smaller summer and winter. It's a very interesting idea of, we have a very fixed idea of a time. They didn't.
They didn't have watches back then, as you said.
Michael.
This is a comment, not a question. I think the way you've addressed this subject is brilliant. Between Sheldon and Richard and Alicia, it's very easy to really understand what you're trying to teach us. And I've started a lot of different Talmud classes over the last 3 or 4 decades, and I've left them all immediately because they threw you in and said, swim or drown. And I drowned. But this really is perfect because you're showing us how to swim in the sea, to use the analogy. And I think you're doing a great job. I'm really excited. And I hope I can attend every one of these. And I think, look at the attendance you're getting, 25 different people. And I think once word of mouth spreads, you might have a lot more than that. So,
thank you. And I know people are going to be looking at the recording. I want to say, Michael, that it took enormous thought because we knew that we could not teach it the way we had learned it. I knew I couldn't. And I have a pile of books behind me that I looked at and I weeded and said, how can we make this accessible and in bites that are small enough so you can digest it for this exact group? So I'm glad you appreciate that. Linda asked why it took so many years to write it down. That's because there were organizations, academies, and they were discussing. And at a certain point, they thought, now we're going to close it. Now we're going to write it down. And the one from Palestine around the Galilee was, they had to rush, and they did it much smaller, much earlier. But the Babylonian Talmud that we're focusing on was like in the 600s.
We're gonna cover a lot of that next week with the history and why we're going to talk about the 2 different Talmuds and how it sort of evolved. So that's coming. It's a reason to get you to come back for week 2.
Good. Any other questions?
I also want to add that there were actual prohibitions against writing it down. The feeling was once something is written down, it becomes stilted. And the Oral Torah has to preserve the give and take so that through the centuries, we can still use it. There were no microwaves during Torah time. So the Oral Torah was supposed to be here so we could continue on and on.
If you take nothing else from today, take what Sheldon just said as the most important point. It was supposed to stay open, and that's why we'll see minority opinions, because they say in the future the situations might change, and that minority opinion might be useful. Patty.
I just need a clarification because this is pretty new to me, and it's really interesting. But does the Talmud cover the entire Torah or just the commandments?
I can go over that. Later on, we'll see, and we have some nice diagrams that we found on the internet, which will show us the connections between the Talmud and all the books of the Torah, not of the Bible, not just the Torah, but all the 24 books. So the short answer is yes, and I'd ask you to hold that because it's a really nice illustration.
These are all good questions. Anything else? Comments, questions?
Diane?
Reactions?
I was really interested with this rabbi from JewsForJudaism.com. If I wanted to know more about the Talmud in between, could I go online, and what was that rabbi's name?
What I can do is I will send you the links and the information to all the things that I use today.
Okay.
And Rabbi Skobach is head of an organization, Jews for Judaism. He's based in Canada, and his organization is directed against organizations that proselytize for Jews, Jews for Jesus, Christian groups. His organization counteracts that. Very effective speaker, lots of things on the internet, but I'll send it out.
Thank you.
As a matter of fact, we might look at the major resources, not all of them, because you should see in the back end what Sheldon and Richard and I have been looking through, but we could take the essence and send it out to the whole group. So somewhere we have all the emails of everybody. Anything else? Well, I would like to say, as we're drawing to a close here, that what I am sensing in the energy of the group as I look around is a certain excitement, openness, receptivity, and a kind of light bulb going off saying, oh, is it that? Is that where we get it from? Is that how we learn about Shabbat candles and circumcision and all those things that we thought, are just, where did we get them from? So I offer a prayer here that all of us can continue that energy, that learning, that openness, so that we can all arrive at a different place in 6 weeks, and that will only be the beginning of our swimming in the sea of Talmud with a sense of acceptance and joy and excitement.